This video is going to be a detailed tutorial of how to use Google Tag Manager. So I'm going to show you how to install it, what exactly it is, how to get everything set up and ready to go so that you can get started. So Google Tag Manager is just a piece of code that you install onto your website or landing page, similar to how you would install a Facebook pixel or Google Analytics container. And what it does is it just listens to the different containers and elements on your website or on your landing page, like when people click a button, for example, or a link, or when they watch a video, or when they submit a form, or when they scroll to a certain depth on your page. It collects that information, and then you can push that information into another program like Google Analytics, for example, or even into your advertising platforms like Facebook Ads Manager or Google Ads. So this allows you to understand how people are interacting with your website, which you can then correlate with the performance of your ad campaigns. This might help you optimize your landing page. You might understand what sections and what elements are assisting in producing conversions, which you can then use to improve the performance of an existing page or a new page in the future. So to create a Google Tag Manager account, we're going to go to tagmanager.google.com. You probably, if you're in Chrome, are already logged into your Gmail account. You can see that I have 3 different Tag Manager containers already inside of this account. Each of them is for a different website. So in order to create a new container, which would be installed on a new website, maybe it's for your business or maybe it's for a client's website, you click on Create Account. We're going to name this account based on the name of the business you're creating this for. Select your country and choose whether or not you want to share data anonymously with Google for benchmarking. Next, we're going to put in the URL for the website that we're going to be tracking. And we're going to select what type of platform this is. So this is a website. Next, we're going to click Create. Once you create and log into your account, it's going to look something like this. On the top, we have our workspace. So this is where we can actually configure the different tags, triggers, and variables, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Versions is where we can see the different version history. So whenever you make one change or multiple changes and then publish them to your site, each one of those published versions can be viewed here. You can kind of see a history of all the changes you've made in the past. And then under the admin tab, we have the options to change some settings, which under user management would allow us to add members of our team or maybe provide access to another marketing agency or maybe to our client as well, so that they have access to the same Tag Manager account. But we're going to be spending most of our time inside of Workspace. Now with a new account, we need to first install this onto our website. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. So there's a few different ways that we can install this depending on the website platform that you're using. On the top here, you'll see we have this tracking code. So this is the unique account ID for this specific Google Tag Manager account. If I click onto this, it's going to open up a tracking code for me to install in the header and body tag of my website or landing page. But if I exit out of this real quick, and if I just copy this, this container ID, depending on the type of website or landing page builder you're using, might be the only information you need to install it onto your website. So I'm in Unbounce, which is a landing page builder that I use a lot for my client work. Inside of Unbounce, we can host multiple domains and subdomains, which is where we build landing pages for our clients. So if I go into Settings and then Script Manager, and then say Add a Script, and then I can select Google Tag Manager, and then I would just paste in that container ID for my Google Tag Manager. So in this case, I don't have to paste in the header or body code that we see here. I just have to paste in that container ID. I'm going to want to make sure that there's no space before and after the code. As you can see, there was a space before, so you want to make sure that you get rid of any of those, otherwise it's not going to install correctly. From here, I just say Add Script Details, and it would install Google Tag Manager on whichever domain I select on the next page here. So on the right-hand side, we have all of the domains and subdomains that have been added into this Unbounce account. So I would just select which domain or subdomain I wanted this Tag Manager container added to, and then say Save and Publish Script, and then Tag Manager would be installed. So that's a nice feature that's included in this particular landing page builder, and that might be true with the website builder or landing page builder that you're using as well. But for most of you, that's not going to be the case. So I'm inside of my WordPress website in the admin portal, and I've gone to Plugins and then clicked on Add New Plugin. And from here, what I'm going to do is say Insert Headers and Footers, and that's going to install a plugin on my WordPress site that allows me to install custom header and footer scripts, which is what we need to do. So once that's installed, I'm going to go to settings and then open up the headers and footers application or plugin. I'm going to go back to my Google Tag Manager account, and I'm going to click on that container ID, open up this dialog with the code that I need to install on my site. I'm going to copy the header code, and so this needs to be installed in the head section of your website. So if I go back to my WordPress site, you'll see that we have the option to add scripts into the header, into the body, and into the footer as well. So this first one we need to install into the header, so I simply copy this, paste it in here, and then I'm going to copy this body tag and then paste it in the body section. And then I'm going to scroll down and click save. And that's going to publish and save these codes into my WordPress website, and that's going to be now installed and good to go. I made a video that goes into way more detail on installing your Facebook Pixel and Facebook Pixel events. You can click on the tags above or in the description below to learn more about that. So there are 3 pillars for understanding how Google Tag Manager works: variables, triggers, and tags. So variables allow us to access the different information when people are interacting with our site, whether they're clicking on links or buttons or videos or submitting forms, or even if they're just scrolling through the page. So these are all the different variables that Google Tag Manager can collect when people are interacting with your site. And we use this information, we use these unique variables to trigger and fire events, which we can then push into other programs like Facebook ads or Google Analytics. And this will make a bit more sense when I actually demonstrate how it works. If we click on the configure button, it's going to show us all of the available built-in variables that Google Tag Manager provides and whether or not we want to activate or deactivate them. So your default configured variables might look a little bit different. I would encourage that you turn on all of the click variables and all of the form video variables, and then all of the video variables as well if you're installing or embedding like YouTube videos on your landing page, for example. And then scroll depth might be helpful as well. So this is when people are scrolling to a certain depth or percentage down your page. If these variables are not turned on, then we can't use them to trigger events. Okay, so we'll come back to variables in just a moment. The second pillar is tags. So tags allow us to send information to other platforms. For example, Facebook Pixel, Google Analytics, and Google Ads are probably the most common ones that certainly I use and probably you'll use as well. So the first thing that I'll use tags for is to actually install the tracking code for Facebook Pixel, Google Ads, and Google Analytics. So similar to how we installed the Google Tag Manager code onto our WordPress site, we could go into our Analytics account, our Facebook Pixel account, and our Google Ads account, take the tracking code, and then paste it into this plugin the exact same way that we've done here with Google Tag Manager, and that would work perfectly fine. But I personally find that it's a lot easier to just go ahead and do that inside of Google Tag Manager, and that's a benefit of using Google Tag Manager, is that you can actually install tracking codes inside of this platform. And so I've already gone ahead and done that for Analytics, but I'll show you what you would do if you didn't already do this. So you would click on New to set up a new tag. We would give this a name. So in this case, I'll say this is my Google Analytics 4 tracking code. We're going to click on Tag Configuration. And there's a bunch of default out-of-the-box tags that Google offers, many of which are for other Google tools, which makes sense. But if you scroll down, you'll probably see some of the tools that you recognize as well, like Crazy Egg, Pinterest, and whatnot. So in this case, I've prior to this created a Google Analytics 4 account, which I'm going to install onto this website. And so in this case, I would just click onto this one here, GA4 configuration, because this is what we want to happen after people visit our site. We want Google Tag Manager to apply this Google Analytics tracking code on every single page whenever people visit any page on our site. Measurement ID, this is going to be the Google Analytics tracking code that you get when you create your Google Analytics account. So I would just go into my account, copy that from my admin settings, paste it in here. And then triggering. So this is what this means is when this happens, this trigger happens, is when we want that Google Analytics code to fire. So in this case, we want it to happen on every single page view. So there's a default trigger that exists in your GTM account, all page views. So I'm going to click on that and click save, and we'd be good to go. So what this means is that when this trigger happens, meaning when any page view on any page on our site is fired, aka when people visit any page on our site, then fire this Google Analytics tracking code. If we wanted to install a Facebook pixel, I would click new. I would name this Facebook pixel. Click on tag configuration. Now there is no default tag for Facebook pixel, so we're going to click on custom HTML. And this is where you would paste in your Facebook pixel code. And then triggering, we do the same thing. We'd want this to fire on every single page view on our site. And then we just press save, and your Facebook pixel will now be installed on this site as well. So that's one way that we can use tags, is to install tracking code for these other programs that we use. A second way that I use Google Tag Manager is to track events. So when people are clicking on buttons, when they're scrolling to a certain depth on the page, when they're clicking on certain hyperlinks, when they're clicking on and watching YouTube videos that have been embedded onto the page, as well as submitting forms. So by default, we don't have any way to measure when people are actually performing those actions, which is why it's useful to set up that measurement inside of Google Tag Manager. And so where do we want this information to be sent to? We want it to be sent to analytics, because that's where we're going to go in and look at where all of these events are happening. So what I'm going to do is click on tag, click on create new. And let's say we have this web page here where I want to trigger whenever people are clicking on this join breadcrumbs newsletter button. And this is on my homepage. So I'm going to call this button and then say email opt-in. Click on tag configuration. And in this case, I want to create an event in Google Analytics. So there is a default tag that's already set up. It's called GA4 event. I'm going to select that. The configuration tag, this is just selecting the Google Analytics property, or container rather, that we've installed onto this website. And we have already done that, and it's called GA. Event name, so this is what's going to show up inside of your analytics account. So I'm just going to name this something like button email opt-in. And then when do we want this to trigger? So we don't want this to trigger on all page views. We want this to trigger only when people click onto this button. So what I'm going to do is press the plus button and create a new trigger. I'm going to name this trigger button email opt-in. Click on trigger configuration. And in this case, it's a click element, right? So it's not a page view. It's not when the window is loaded. It's not just a link. It's actually an element on the page. So this is what we want, or when we want this tag to be fired, is when somebody clicks on a specific element. Now we don't want it to fire on any click, because that would mean if somebody clicked on over here in this random spot, that would cause this to trigger. We only want it to trigger on certain clicks, specifically when people click onto this button. So we would select some clicks. And then this is where we get to select the different variables. So when somebody clicks onto this button, based on the URL of this specific page that this button exists on, based on the class of this HTML element, based on the text of this button, there's many different variables that define what this specific button is. And so in Google Tag Manager, what we're going to do is define that specific button click by a unique variable to that button. And so in this case, the text of this button, Join Breadcrumbs Newsletter, is pretty unique. I don't think that exists anywhere else on my website. So I'm going to search for click text contains Join Breadcrumbs Newsletter. And this is case sensitive as well. So we want to make sure that this matches exactly. And then I'm going to click save. And so now we have our tag and trigger set up. So what is happening is when somebody clicks onto an element where the click text says specifically Join Breadcrumbs Newsletter, then fire this tag, and the tag is sending an event to our Google Analytics account, and that event name is button email opt-in. So if I save this and I go to triggers, we can now see that that trigger exists. So if I wanted to just create a single trigger, I could do that in this section here. And if I go to tags, now we have that tag that we set up as well. And up at the top here, we can see workspace changes is 3. So we've made 3 changes to this workspace. One was the tag, one was the trigger, and there must have been another change as well that we made. And so they're not published live to our site yet. If we wanted to publish them, we would simply press submit. But before we do that, we want to test and make sure that this actually works the way that we intend it to. So we're going to click on preview and enter Google Tag Manager's debug and preview mode. And so this is going to open up a new tab for the tag assistant. And what we're doing here is inserting a URL that we want to test. And so we want to test that URL, the button that we just set up that tag for, which was on the home page here. So I'm going to enter that there, click on start. That's then going to open that website in a new tab, and it's going to connect the 2 programs together and allow us to test this new tag manager setup. You can see in the bottom right corner, we now have this dialog that says debugger connected. We have this yellow square. And if I go back into this other tab, we can click continue and we see the yellow square. So now these two, this debugger tool has been successfully connected to our page. And now we're going to be able to go and test the different events on our page and make sure that our tags are firing correctly. So what we're seeing on the left-hand side here are all of the events that have already happened since we just loaded this page. The first one was the container loaded, so that just happens when your page first loads. The DOM was ready and the window loaded. So you'll probably see these 3 or a similar events that get loaded when your page first starts. But then if I go back to the page and I click onto this button now, and then I go back to the tag assistant, we now have a new event that's being logged, and it's a click event. And you can see that this tag that we set up, the button email opt-in tag, has been fired. So if I click into this, it's going to show me the different properties and conditions that were met and the reason that this was successfully fired. So you can see that the firing trigger that we had set up, this is the name of that trigger, and the conditions of that trigger was, first of all, that it's a click event. If I go back to where we had this set up, and then I click into this, the trigger was a clicks all element, right? So it was a click event. And so that's what this means here. This is just registering that it was a click event. And then we also set up a condition that the click text contains join breadcrumbs newsletter. And we can see the check marks next to both of these variables confirm that those conditions were met when we clicked on that button here. And for that reason, our tag was successfully fired. We can also see the different variables when that specific click happens. So if you remember at the beginning when I was talking about variables, every time you perform an event, when you like click on elements and stuff like that, the different variables that you've enabled in your account will pull in specific unique information based on that click or that event that you triggered. So in this case, on this click event, you can see all of the different variables that we've enabled. If we scroll to the bottom, all of the video variables are undefined. That's because none of those variables were fired when we clicked on a button. Those are only relevant for video containers. Neither were the scroll depth variables. Those are not relevant to clicking a button. But a lot of these ones at the top here are relevant for clicking on a button. So this first one just signifies that our mouse button was clicked. The click classes was primary. So I'm in a Chrome browser, so if I right click onto this and click on inspect, I can actually preview the HTML and CSS for this web page. So for this specific button, you can see the HTML code has a class name of primary. So that matches the click class that we see here in the variable section of that click event that we fired on this web page. And so that could be a condition that we could set to actually trigger this. If this class is unique to this specific button on our website, then instead of saying the click text contains this string, we could potentially change that to be if this click class contains primary, then it would also fire that trigger in the same way. We see here the click text is join breadcrumbs newsletter, the page host name, the page URL. So there's some different information here. And so basically what we're trying to achieve here is we want to know when people click onto this button so that when we're in our analytics account, we can measure that against the total amount of people that visited our site. And so the challenge is finding variables that are unique to that specific event. I made another Google Tag Manager video that goes into detail on how to use this Tag Assistant and Debug tool. So you can click in the cards above or in the description below to watch that video and learn more. So for example, if I open up our trigger event again, at the moment we say whenever somebody clicks any element and the click text contains join breadcrumbs newsletter. So that works in this case, but instead if we had said if the page URL contains Ryan-Ferguson and we press save. So I've reconnected the debugger mode. Let's say I scroll down and I just click on this random header here, not the button, and we go back into our Tag Assistant. Now we can see that click that we just performed, and we can see that that fired the button event or the button tag. Now we didn't want that to happen because I didn't actually click on the button. But if we look at this, it matched all of the conditions that we set up in our trigger, and the conditions that we set up was that it has to be a click and that the page URL contains Ryan Ferguson. So the reason this didn't work was because we defined a specific variable that wasn't unique to that button click. Any click element on the page is going to contain the page URL Ryan-Ferguson because that's in the domain of that page. So what we really want to do is look at these variables. We want to first of all click on whichever element we want to trigger. So in this case, we'll click on the button. We're going to go into the Tag Assistant, open up that click that we just performed, go into the variables section, and try and find a variable in the left-hand column here that's unique to that button click. And in this case, the join breadcrumbs newsletter seems to be probably unique. It's possible that we have a form that's similar to this that has the same button text on another page in our website, in which case we might want to add an additional condition where we say the click text contains join breadcrumbs newsletter and the click or the page URL contains, in this case, it's on the primary domain, so that wouldn't work. But on the other page, if the URL was ryan-ferguson.com/blog, then we would say also contains page URL equals ryan-ferguson.com/blog. That way we can create two different trigger events. We can name them something different, and we can have those push different event names into Google Analytics so that we can separate those two different events from each other. So I know this information can be kind of confusing, so let me just give you a brief summary again now that we've seen each of these in action. So Google Tag Manager is built around these three different pillars: variables, tags, and triggers. So the variables are the different types of information that we can collect whenever people interact with our site. So each interaction will pull in data for each of these variables. We can then use that unique variable information to set up triggers on events that are important to us, whether that's a conversion event or even when somebody just performs an interaction that's interesting for us. For example, scrolling to a certain depth on our website or watching a video. Whenever that trigger occurs, we can have that fire a tag to send information to our Facebook pixel or to our Google Analytics account so we can actually track and measure that event against the total website traffic to that page. If you found this video helpful and are interested in learning more about Google Tag Manager, make sure you check out the links in the description below to the other videos, as well as a playlist on my other Google Tag Manager tutorials. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.